a shocking New York Times investigation revealing that businesses across the United States are exploiting unaccompanied minors who had to flee their homeland. And as we'll see with this headline here that came from the New York Times expose that led to this Biden administration announcement, alone and exploited migrant children work brutal jobs across the US. Yes, some children as young as 13 were found to be working physically grueling and demanding jobs. But before we jump into what the administration says it's going to do, let's go ahead and look at the problem here. Also from the New York Times. In just the past 2 years, more than 250,000 children have come into the country alone. Many of them are under tremendous pressure to send money back to their parents, as well as pay thousands of dollars in smuggling fees, and in some cases, rent and living expenses to their sponsors. Most are from Central America, where economic conditions have deteriorated since the pandemic. Now, these practices definitely flout child labor laws. We know that without question. And these laws have been in place for more than a century. But there are these organizations, these companies, including some big brand names that are reportedly involved. Children now are working hazardous jobs in every state and across industries, making products in the American supply chains of major brands and retailers, including J.Crew, Walmart, Target, Ben & Jerry's, Fruit of the Loom, Ford, and General Motors, the Times found. They are finding jobs in slaughterhouses, construction sites, and factories, positions that have long been off limits to American children. Now, one of the children, 15-year-old Carolina Yock, well, she came to the United States on her own last year to live with a relative that she had never met before. And this is what she said to the Times. Sometimes I get tired and feel sick. Her stomach often hurt, and she was unaware or unsure if that was because of the lack of sleep, the stress from the incessant roar of the machines, or the worries she had for herself and her family in Guatemala. But I'm getting used to it. Yeah, it's estimated that about 2/3 of all unaccompanied migrant children, they end up working full time. And these are not children who have stolen into the country undetected. The federal government knows they are in the United States, and the Department of Health and Human Services is responsible for ensuring sponsors will support them and protect them from trafficking or exploitation. But as more and more children have arrived, the Biden White House has ramped up demands on staffers to move the children quickly out of shelters and release them to adults. Caseworkers say they rush through vetting sponsors. And clearly this rushing through vetting sponsors is enabling these children to end up in the hands of taskmasters, basically exploiting their labor, having them work hours and hours at a time, but also work in environments that are not safe and that they shouldn't be in because they're children. This is appalling, especially seeing so many household brand names on that list that are benefiting from exploiting migrant children's labor. Rayyvana.
Yeah, I think that quote that you read from Carolina Yock is particularly devastating because she ended it by saying, but I'm getting used to it. And no child, nowhere in the world should be getting used to doing that type of grueling manual labor. That is absolutely devastating. And on top of that, I think this is a huge indictment of the concept of unfettered capitalism. There's this idea among conservatives who promote unregulated capitalism that the market will do what's best. But here we have these massive brands, these companies that almost everybody uses. You said household brands, it's exactly it. And they are willing to exploit child labor, children as young as 13 years old, to cut costs. And that's why they're doing this. And if they think that they can get away with it, if they think that there'll be no oversight or no accountability, that they will continue doing it, which is why it's so important for the government to step in these cases, which is what the Biden administration has said it's going to do. And I hope it's successful.
I do too, and I also hope that individuals will hold these brands accountable. I know that seeing some of those names up there, some of them weren't shocking, like Walmart, I almost assumed. But then when you see Ben & Jerry's, it's known as being a very progressive company that's always at the forefront of putting out statements when people were afraid to back Black Lives Matter as truly a movement. Ben & Jerry's had no problem saying white supremacy in its statement. It really seemed like they were on the progressive edge, but now it makes me wonder, what are people doing truly when you pull back the curtain? Is this child exploitation and labor of these migrant children, is this something that everybody dabbles in? Or is this something that only a few major companies? I definitely would like to know. And I'd also like to know what the Biden administration is doing to actually address this issue. And so let's go ahead and look at what they've announced that they plan on doing in terms of making changes. So on Monday, senior administration officials said Health and Human Services would now direct operators to return calls to children and also require them to explain what local law enforcement agency would be in touch. Department staff members will also give more information to sponsors and underage migrants about child labor protections. I just gotta pause right there and say, really? So y'all weren't returning their calls and you're gonna act like this is some kind of monumental landmark change that you're making in terms of we're gonna return their calls and maybe tell them that people are gonna exploit them and give them the knowledge and information so that they don't end up in the hands of these exploitative companies. Like, give me a break. That should have been done a long time ago. It should have been kind of the baseline expectations that I would have had of the government. Rayyvana, do you want to get on this?
Yeah, I mean, I worked in immigration law for a little bit, and it's not surprising to me at all. They really don't care that much, especially about the children that go through the immigration system. But massively disappointing that they would even have to come out and say, we're going to start, at the very least, start listening to the complaints being made by these migrants.
Yeah, that is absolutely wild to me. And to be honest, I'd be extremely embarrassed. I wouldn't have put that stuff out there, but it almost tells you somebody else would have. But it also tells you that these children were probably complaining a lot before the New York Times put out this expose. It's just the government wasn't listening. But let's go ahead and get back to the other promises the government makes, promises to make in terms of change. So as part of the effort, the Department of Labor will focus investigations on geographical areas where tips about violations rarely come in. Migrant children are among the least likely workers to reach out to labor inspectors for help with workplace issues. The department also will explore using a hot goods provision of law that allows it to stop the interstate transportation of goods where child labor has been found in the supply chain, according to senior administration officials. In addition, it will ask Congress to increase penalties for violators. Federal investigators have long complained that the maximum fine for child labor violations, which is $15,000 per occurrence, is not enough to deter child labor. Wow. This is just like, it just keeps telling you and showing you the shortcomings that were already in place and why this is so rampant in terms of exploiting these migrant children. Because when you have $15,000 violations, like, get out of here. That's not even a drop in the bucket for Walmart, Target, all of these major companies. And so of course it would be worthwhile for them to go ahead and violate these child labor laws and exploit these migrant children, since really, it's not even going to make a dent in any form or fashion on their books whatsoever. The thing about these migrant children also being taken advantage of is the fact that we are living in a time where we're seeing a lot of nations try to recover from the pandemic and the hurt. As we heard, a lot of these children are coming up from South America as they struggle to come back from the pandemic. But also when we cross the waters over there toward Europe, toward the Middle East, we're also seeing a lot of fleeing as well. And we had just seen this past weekend with news that at least 59 migrants from Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, and Iran, including 12 children, died. And also dozens more are feared to be missing after their boat sank in rough seas off southern Italy. The reality here is that we are seeing so many exodus out there of people fleeing for help and going to places that they hope will be better for them, only to find situations where they could potentially lose their life or they are being mistreated and truly exploited in favor of capitalism. And that's not how we should be treating human beings in any way. Rayyvana.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just add that the immigration system within the United States has shown, you could consider it an indifference towards, or I would see it more as a malice towards children who are immigrating alone. Children as young as 3 years old are expected to alone go through the immigration process, go through the court system. Judges have argued that they could adequately explain to a 3-year-old the ramifications of the immigration process. It's absurd, but so often you'll see children being forced to go through this process alone. They're given very little education on how the system works, what their rights are. So we'll see also people who are afraid to even report the injustices that they're experiencing because they're fearful that it could have an impact on their immigration status or ultimately result in them getting deported, which I think is important in this case because we're talking about children who are sending money back home to their families. There's a lot at stake for them if they think that they're going to be deported or if something's going to impede their ability to help support their family, they're not going to come forward and report it. So even the number of reports that they've been getting so far about this type of abuse of children in the working world, it's going to be severely undercounted because there's going to be so many children that either don't know where to report this injustice to, or children who are too afraid to come forward and say that they are the victims of it.
Absolutely, and especially those who may not even know that this is wrong. Even though the adults, clearly these companies, those in positions of power are well aware. They have to be because this is not just injustice, it's inhumane. To be exploiting children that are this young, this small, and forcing them to work for hours on end in grueling environments that are threatening their health. Nobody can tell me that they didn't know. Everybody had to have known in this situation that this is completely and totally unacceptable. And I truly hope these individuals are held accountable. And I would like to see a lot more than civil fines. I think there should be criminal fines without a doubt. Human trafficking, whatever needs to be logged as, it's completely and totally in need of being prosecuted to the full extent of the law.